Now on to more important matters. We have two of the most eminent and also well-known public intellectuals in the country speaking this afternoon. They are active both in a policy arena and also in the public arena. Professor Hugh White is a Professor of Strategic Studies at ANU. He has been an intelligence analyst, senior staffer to Beazley and Hawke, senior official in the Defence Department. He has many influential publications. You probably have heard him. You would also probably realise that he's been on and off more political Christmas card lists than any other academic in the nation. Another stirrer, Professor Will Steffen, is councillor of the now publicly funded Climate Council, and he is a global change professor at ANU working on the incorporation of human processes in Earth systems modelling. They're both going to talk to us today about how to talk policy, how to raise the standard of public debate and commentary on climate and other issues. Today is really about all of us improving the way in which we do science outreach and science advocacy. And I've certainly learnt a lot today. I think we've got a lot to learn from these gentlemen, not about how to become lobbyists, but how to increase our profile and become very effective public intellectuals who make a real difference in the policy debate. So please welcome to the stage our two academics, Hugh and Will. Where are they? Thank you.
Well, Will's kindly allowed me to go first, so I'm Hugh White, he's Will Steffen. Well, thank you, Emma, for that kind introduction. Yes, you're quite right about Christmas card lists. It's amazing how they go up and down. And what I want to do is to perhaps help fill out and maybe elaborate a little on some of the things you've heard today about how people from outside the policy world influence policy. And I do this myself as I sort of had a career, most of my career as a policymaker, now as an academic, so I kind of stand across those two realms. You guys got a meeting with some politicians tomorrow, so you're all, I guess, starting to think about, you know, how do you talk to these sorts of people? And what I want to do is to offer you a couple of quick points about how policymakers and others in the policy debate think and how to talk to them. And the first message I want to give to you is that people in the policy business think differently from you in a very fundamental way. Policy is different from science. Science, and for that matter other academic work, is about finding the truth. It's about building knowledge. That's not what policy is about. Policymakers aren't after the truth. Now that sounds a little cynical, but I mean it quite literally. The business of policy is the business of making decisions. Discussions about policy are discussions about decisions. And the logic of decisions, the way in which people move towards decisions, is actually quite different from the logic of science, the logic of truth. I don't want to drag you back to my former incarnation as a philosopher, but actually Aristotle understood this. Aristotle developed a very sophisticated logic of deductive and inductive syllogisms as to how you can derive truth. And he had something completely different called the practical syllogism, which is how you make decisions. The conclusion of a practical syllogism is an action. These guys, the people you're talking to tomorrow, and policymakers in general and those in the policy debate, are about actions. Everything else is secondary. So everything you say to a policymaker, everything you say in a policy debate, should focus on how your knowledge helps them make decisions, and remember that they're not at all the same thing. And also, of course, just remember that as soon as they think what you're talking about is how their money can help you make knowledge, you're going to lose interest. That bit has to come via your way of explaining how your knowledge helps their decisions. Now, in order to understand how to do that, you do have to understand a little bit about the logic of decision making. And it's a bit different from Aristotle. And it's a bit more complicated, but not much. There are really only three parts of every decision: defining your objectives, identifying your means, and working out how much you're going to spend on it. And working out the relationship between setting objectives, defining options, and allocating resources is about 90% of what policymakers do most of the time. Now, working out how best to apply your knowledge to their decisions is very much a matter of working out how best to plug what you know into those steps of the policy process. And understanding that process, understanding the choices they're making, the processes they're going through, makes it a hell of a lot easier for you to make that contribution. The way I've always done this is actually to think about breaking that down into a very simple set of 5 questions. Every policymaker, as he or she goes about their business of trying to make decisions, is at one stage or another of these 5 questions. What's the problem? Trying to define the problem. Why does it matter? And how much does it matter? A very important step in the process, because until you know how much the problem matters, you don't know how much you're going to be willing to spend on it. What are the options for addressing it? Which one is best? And can we afford it? It's pretty simple. And if what you bring to a policy conversation isn't going to help the person on the other side of the table answer one or more of those questions, then don't go to the conversation until you've worked out how you can help them answer one of those questions, because that's the only way you're going to end up communicating with them. The other point, of course, is that it's not quite as simple as that, because it sounds from that as if it's a linear process. It starts with defining a problem and setting some objectives to fix it. It's not that easy, because in government, in any form of policy, no objective is ever independent of the resources involved. What you actually want to do depends all the time on how much it's going to cost you to do it. And so there's a loop. You have to help the policymakers go around the loop in which they define objectives, look at options to resolve it, work out how much they're going to cost, and then go back to the beginning and ask whether they're really serious about that objective to that sum of money or not. And the last point to make about that way that logic works is that it's dynamic. That is, all the elements keep shifting, including the knowledge. There's a kind of a tendency to think that the way in which people from your kind of background influence people up there is a kind of a one-off dump. Here's some knowledge, put it to work. But in fact, it's a much more dynamic process than that. The objectives keep on shifting, the data, of course, keeps on shifting, the costs keep on shifting. Everything's in motion the whole time. And so any significant, serious policy engagement has got to stay engaged. It's not like building a wall where you go along and contribute your brick and then go back home. It's more like a tennis match. The ball is in the air the whole time, and you've got to be there playing your part, hitting the ball backwards and forwards across the net. It's a long-term engagement. Now, who's the audience then? I've talked about policymakers as if they're a kind of a single unified bunch, and in many ways, and in ways that I'm sure you'll have heard earlier today, in fact, it's quite a complex flora out there. There are politicians themselves, there are their staffers, there are the public servants, there are the lobbyists and other stakeholders, and there's the media. I personally think that there is less difference in the way you speak to those different audiences in the policy world than you might think. If any of them are doing their job well, they'll all be trying to work through the same kind of policy logic I've just sketched. And to me, the best way of thinking about, and often actually the best way of communicating with those people, is not directly but through the media. I often say, only half-jokingly, the only reason anyone bothers writing for newspapers anymore, given that nobody seems to read them, is that the politicians do, and it's the best way of communicating with them. But it's a broader point, that if you can hone your message in such a way that it can attract the attention of an opinion page editor, or the person putting together a news bulletin, or the person putting together PM Agenda on Sky News or whatever, then you'll be 98% of the way to putting your message together in such a way that other participants in the policy world will listen to it, and also that they'll hear it because they'll be watching or reading the same stuff. And of course, what that means is, in effect, that you have to not just talk like a policymaker, you have to really kind of become a policymaker. You have to adopt their way of thinking, their way of approaching issues and their way of talking. And that is quite challenging for people. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do. It's not easy for scientists, it's also not easy for other people with particular very strong intellectual cultures, because this intellectual culture is different, it works in different principles. I think one of the biggest challenges we all face is working out how we bring our principles about how we think and how we talk to bear in an environment in which, to be effective, we have to think and talk in a very different way. Well, I've got a few sort of, I guess you call them slogans, that I try and work by. The first is, the aim is always, of course, to simplify without distortion. One of the biggest challenges is to just see how simply you can say something without actually distorting your meaning. And I think the work you put in to simplifying your message without distorting it is the single most important thing you do in a way of learning to speak to policymakers effectively in any audience. The second is, you've got to be more than simple, you've got to be vivid. And you've got to be vivid without provocation. It's quite easy to catch people's attention if you just say something rude or outrageous. But catching their attention by saying something vivid and striking without being needlessly provocative. You don't want to avoid being provocative if the issue is actually one that which requires or demands provocation, but not being needlessly provocative is terrifically important. And how long you get. That's being vivid and simple is more important than being concise, in my opinion. How long people will pay attention to you will depend on how simple and how vivid the message is. If it's simple and it's vivid and they're sure it's important, they'll listen to you for a while. If it's too complicated or if it's not vivid enough, they'll lose interest, no matter how quick you are. And the third point is to recognise the difference between advocacy and polemic. If you get into the policy world, you will be advocating something. You can't get into the policy world, you can't influence the decisions that governments or anybody else makes without advocating them. You've got to push for them. You've got to be prepared to push for them. And that makes some people uncomfortable. A lot of people think that advocacy is not what we should be about. I think that mistakes the distinction between advocacy and polemic. The distinction is very important. Advocacy is always based on, or should always be based on, analysis. The position I advocate is based on the analysis I've made. Polemic runs the other way round. The position I advocate is based on the ideas I started with, the ideology I started with, or the prejudices I had. So the key there, I think, is always to make sure that as you get things simple and vivid, you also keep them tied right back to the analysis and don't let your own sort of sense of the drama of the debate allow your advocacy to turn into polemic. 3 last observations. When you throw your ideas into the policy debate, you lose them. They're no longer yours. When you put them in a referee journal, they've got your name across the top and you own them. But once they're out there in the policy debate, you can't bring them back. So you've got to be prepared to throw your ideas into the policy debate. It's a little bit like letting your children go into the world. They'll take on a life of their own and they won't necessarily acknowledge you in retrospect. So you've got to be brave enough to let your ideas go. You've got, of course, to be brave enough not to be afraid of criticism, because you will get it. And there's no substitute for just recognising that people say, perhaps sometimes, unpleasant things about your ideas and sometimes even about you. And my last point is, once the criticism starts, don't respond to the critics. Just respond to their arguments. Thank you very much.
Right, well, thanks very much, Hugh. I think you've actually covered some of the points I want to make. But specifically, I'll be referring to the climate change quote-unquote debate. And the first point I want to make is, in fact, there isn't one, although you would be confused if you looked at much of the media across Australia. So if you actually dive into the scientific world itself, the sort of world that we're all very familiar with in the journals, the assessments and so on, there is no debate, and there hasn't been for several decades. The very basics about what's going on with the climate system are really extremely well understood. Number one, the climate system is being destabilized, and that's happening at a rapid rate. Number two, we know very well why that's occurring. The primary reason is increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we all know where they come from. And the last point we know really well is that a destabilizing climate is bringing increasing risks to all sorts of things, ultimately to our own well-being, our health, our economic well-being, and so on. Now, this is really well known. There's no debate. Any way you want to measure it, whether you do surveys, whether you count journal articles, whether you look at assessments, somewhere between 95 and 100% of the scientists who work in that field understand this really well. So, all right, what's the problem? Well, I think Hugh's touched on this really well. The problem is when science starts entering the policy arena. Now, I'm not an expert on this field like Hugh is, so what I'm going to do is just share some observations that I've made over the years working in this space. And I want to do it in a certain way. One is obviously working in the Australian context. I've had a number of roles. I've been on the multi-party climate change committee under the previous government, which developed the clean energy package. I've been a climate councillor and a climate commissioner before that. And I've been a science advisor to the Department of Climate Change and its predecessors, starting from John Howard's government up until the most recent government. I'm no longer a science advisor to the present government. But I want to contrast that with working for 7.5 years in Scandinavia, based in Stockholm, Sweden, and working mainly in the Nordic countries, obviously Sweden, also Norway, Denmark, Finland, and so on. First observation, this phony debate is mainly an Anglo problem. It exists mainly in the English-speaking world. When I was running an international research program, I was working out of Scandinavia, but in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in South America. It is mainly a problem of the English-speaking world, and it's more dominant in the new lands and in the resource-rich lands. So I'm talking about the United States, Canada, and Australia, much less so the United Kingdom, which has one leg in the Anglo world and one leg in Europe, although it seems to be somewhat conflicted over that from time to time, but nevertheless on the climate change issue, seems to be more akin to European countries than it does to its offshoots in the New World. I think what's underneath that is that our political system, unfortunately, has evolved toward a more divisive, a more contentious system than it was 35 years ago when I first came down to Australia. The American system has likewise gone to a much more divisive, contentious system. That's certainly in contrast to the Scandinavian countries who work right across the political spectrum in their country towards consensus. Their gut reaction to any major problem is, let's get together and talk and talk and talk until we get a solution that goes right across the political spectrum. Unfortunately, ours and the Americans and the Canadians and so on tends to be, let's make a political football out of this and kick it around. Now, I think Hugh said this really, really well. He said the difference between analysis and polemic. Unfortunately, climate change is very much in the realm of polemic in the Australian political system. And I find this all the time when I deal with people outside the climate science community itself. Many people now are coming at this problem from the preset belief systems, their political belief systems, sometimes their religious belief systems. That's on the polemic side. Whereas if you watch a so-called debate on Danish TV or on Swedish TV, it's very much in the analysis mode. People sort of leave their political beliefs on the coat hanger coming into the room, and they talk about what does the data say, what does the science say, and they actually arrive at some conclusions. And that's why they have fairly unified approaches to getting their emissions down. And of course, the other thing that's pretty obvious to most people is the influence of powerful vested interest groups. That's why I made the comment about countries like the United States and Australia being resource rich. Obviously, there are very strong vested interests who have a lot to lose with effective climate action. And this isn't the first time we've seen this play out in the political spectrum. A model that's often been used for what's happening now in the climate change debate is the so-called debate over whether smoking, cigarette smoking, passive smoking has anything at all to do with your health, in particular with lung cancer. And of course, effective action was held up for decades by very powerful lobby groups. And very interestingly, if you read a book called Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes in the United States, Actually, some of the same powerful interest groups are actually putting money into the climate change denial industry as they were into the tobacco industry and so on. So I think those are some of the elements that we see at play here. We're suffering more from polemic and less than analysis out in the public on this issue. We have powerful vested interest groups pushing their agendas very effectively and so on. So the last part of my talk is, well, how do we elevate this? How do we move beyond this phony infantile debate about the science and so on? Well, I think the news for all of you is there's not a whole lot scientists can do about that. Because as Hugh said, and as I think I've tried to point out, we're operating in a different space. This isn't a science space. This isn't an argument about scientific veracity, about who can publish in the highest quality journals, whose data is better, whose models are better, and so on. We're actually now touching on belief systems and powerful interest groups. I will have one comment, though, about the media, and that's this idea of balance. We have to have balance in the media. So for every report that comes out of CSIRO or the Bureau, we need to dredge up some survey on Bondi who said he hasn't seen the sea level rise or whatever. You've seen it in some of our leading journals. But the interesting thing is when you talk to experts in the field, researchers who actually study the media, they will tell you that there are more fundamental principles in the media than quote-unquote balance. There are things like fairness, accuracy, and professionalism. So I think the first challenge to elevate this debate is for certain elements of the media, and I'm not trying to tar all of the Australian media with that brush, but I think we know who some of those elements are, to challenge them to come up and lift their level of professionalism. Journalism is supposed to be about fairness and accuracy. Now, obviously, that may require a bit of investigative journalism to see why this isn't operating in certain elements of the media. The other, I think, is for people not just in the media, but in the private sector and so on, to just sit back, take a deep breath, and look at what's going on in the rest of the world and say, why do we have a problem in Australia? Bangladesh can get it, Sweden can get it, Germany can get it, China can get it, all these other countries can get it. Look at what their academies of science say, look at what all the big assessments say, and just say, look, it's about time we actually move on to this because we do have a problem, and it's really deleterious to developing good policy and good approaches that we keep denying that we have a problem. The last point I want to make is that there is some advantage to actually starting to talk about change being a good thing. And that actually requires another type of scholarship, again, that I'm not expert in, but that is actually now coming to the fore in very many areas. And that's to look at what has happened in the past to societies which have failed to recognize some fundamental threats to their further development and their further well-being. And in fact, the most common, if you look at this through history, through archaeology, through anthropology, the most common dynamic of societies is not to simply keep developing in a nice linear or exponential post-World War II growth fashion. Most societies reach some sort of high point and then they collapse, often rather suddenly. See it dramatically in Easter Island, you see it in the Mayans, you see it in the Romans. That actually is the rule, not the exception. It's rare, and those people who study this tell me it's rare that you see societies actually transform themselves. Those that have been able to do it inevitably challenge their fundamental beliefs. They accept knowledge that their society, their societal direction is under threat, and they have some rational discussions around that and change. And I think what Hugh was saying is that's really hard to do, to get that sort of knowledge into a policy development setting. But a few societies have actually succeeded in doing that. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. Let's try to elevate the debate on climate change science, but it's going to go well beyond scientists themselves to be able to do that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, professors. That was really interesting. We have time for questions, and I'm sure many of you bursting to ask these fellows a few things about their experiences. Just so you've got a moment to think of some questions, there are going to be some roving mics. I have the first one. So many academics and researchers are now being invited by various government agencies at the state and national level to provide expertise. So they're being asked as experts for their opinions on various things. it can be quite challenging to do that, and a lot of researchers can be quite scared of that process because they fear their expertise being used in a debate rather than not used in the wrong way, I meant. Yeah, so, or misused. So what advice do you have to all of us for interacting in that manner?
Okay, I'll start with that. If they want to use it or abuse it, they're going to anyway. So my view is it's better to be in there at least trying to make sure that the salient points that policy people are interested in do get across. There's no guarantee they won't be used in different ways. As Hugh said, it's a different arena. There are different goals, different ways of working. But in a modern 21st century world, there are a lot of areas in which science does intersect with policy. And there are a lot of opportunities. A lot of politicians do realize that having knowledge does help from time to time in making good decisions. But I think Hugh made the critical points. You're not going to give a lecture like you do in Climate Change 101 over at the ANU. You got to be really on top of what are the main areas of in my case, climate change, that are under discussion in the policy arena. What's the type of knowledge that's required? How is that understandable to someone who's not an expert in the field? Get rid of your jargon, get rid of your preconceived notions about how you think you should present climate science, and engage. And I have to say that does take experience. You won't do it right the first time, but persevere.
Yes, a really good question. I'd make 2 points. The first is you want to negotiate your role in the policy process you're being invited to join. I talked before about policy logic, but how that actually turns out in practice, who's making the decisions, who's doing which bit of making the decisions, that is very circumstantial. That depends a great deal on understanding the environment. And if you're going to get involved, you're going to commit some of your time, you're going to commit to a certain extent some of your credibility if your name's there, into a policy process. You're going to want to understand how that policy process works and what role you're going to have in it. Are you going to get to comment on the paper just before it goes up from the junior bureaucrat to the senior bureaucrat? Are you going to get to comment on the paper before it goes from the senior bureaucrat to the cabinet? Are you going to get to cabinet and get to comment on the paper in front of the ministers? Where you're going to fit into the process is going to make a huge difference to the sort of impact you're going to have and the extent to which you can influence the outcome. And you can negotiate that. If they want you in it, then you're in a position to say, well, I'm prepared to come in it, but only if I get this kind of role and this kind of access. That means you've got to understand the environment as well as you can beforehand. A little bit of intelligence is a very handy thing in that context. The second point is, so to speak, looking over your shoulder. If you're anything like me, you have to worry about what this is going to mean for your day job. And one of the challenges we all face is that most universities and other research institutions are very keen to have their staff involved in policy debates, but are not so clever at working out how that fits into performance agreements. So you want to negotiate forward into government, but also negotiate back with your boss to make sure that this is not going to end up being something you just do on the weekend, because you'll soon get sick of that, let me tell you.
Some excellent points. We have a question at the back here.
A question for Professor Stefan. So, your talk and many articles on the topic of climate change start with, there's this consensus between 95 and 97% of researchers agree with it. And then it moves on. But my question is, shouldn't we work on that consensus? Because, 95% is not a high number, really, right? I mean, a particle physicist wouldn't get out of bed with 95%. They would keep measuring until there's a 3 sigma or 5 sigma agreement, right? So what drives these 5 people? Amongst us, there should be 5 or 6 people. If we were all climate researchers, there should be 5 or 6 people here who say, no, climate change is not an issue. It's not a big problem, and it won't happen to that degree. So what can we do as scientists to convince those other 5 people that to essentially join the consensus?
Okay, a bit of history. That 95 to 100% is probably a number over the last decade. If you would have looked 3 decades ago, it wouldn't have been nearly that high. I think it's much more complex than particle physics, and I'm not trying to have a go at physicists. We're talking about a complex system, all right? We're talking about the Earth system, one of the most complex systems that humanity's ever dealt with, and we're part of it. So that makes it a much trickier system to deal with. Now, why are there still 2 or 3% who may go against the consensus? Well, there's still arguments about some of the complex feedbacks that either amplify or dampen the initial warming from CO2. That's an example of that. But as time goes on, we're understanding those feedbacks much better. We're getting observations. We're understanding some of the fundamental processes better. And that's why that consensus is solidifying. So I would argue when you're looking at an extremely complex system like that, getting to 95% is a massive consensus. I don't see that anywhere else looking in sort of ecological environmental sciences where you're invariably dealing with very messy systems.
And if I could just make the observation, it's a hell of a lot better than most of the consensus that most governments act on when they're making other kinds of decisions in other kinds of fields. You never get 95% of economists to agree on anything, but governments make economic decisions every day.
And we have a question in the middle.
Yes, I'm Hamish Clark. I'm a scientist and junior bureaucrat with the Office of Environment and Heritage in New South Wales. I really resonated to your comments about scientists finding out about the decision-making process and how they can get involved in it. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on the direction or push from policy for evidence-based policy making or something along those lines, whether you see that as something that's kind of changing or developing or is encouraging.
It's a very good question. And it goes to some of the points that Will was making. This is kind of a hard thing to say, actually. But how well people like you can contribute to the policy process depends partly on how good the policy process is. And we do have a model of the policy process which suggests that, the people involved in it are more or less rational actors, and they're looking for data which helps support the best policy outcomes. They clearly define their objectives, and they look for the most cost-effective solution to achieve those objectives, and they look at the most cost-effective way to deliver those means, and the whole thing goes around the loop and you get a good answer. And most of the time, most policy works reasonably well, and most of the time countries like Australia, actually Australia has most of the time, for most of its history, been quite a well-governed place. That's one of the reasons why all of this works. But don't take that for granted. Quite a few countries, for quite a lot of their history, are actually quite badly governed. The policy decisions are not well made. The phrase evidence-based policy, which rolls off people's tongues, including politicians' tongues and public servants' tongues, got a nice feel to it. But actually, you've really got to push back a lot of pressures to keep evidence at the forefront of the policy process. And, really the story that Will's telling, in a sense, the story of his life, and actually in a different way the story of my life and my own field of interest, strategic studies, is the story of governments, the policy process in general, not just governments actually, but the broader policy process, not living up to the standards of excellence, quality, rigour, discipline that we expect, that we are used to, and which have in fact resulted in a society that manages to build a nice building like this in the middle of its National Gallery. It doesn't happen by accident. Now, Will has said there are plenty of examples in history of societies that haven't adapted, and plenty of examples in history of societies that have. And we tend to assume that we're in the latter category. And just to scare you, because there is, my field is completely different from Will's. My main interest is strategic studies and international affairs. What does Australia do about the role of armed force in international affairs? Very unscientific business. They're all crazy out there. But the very striking thing about Australia's present position is that our strategic environment is changing fundamentally. The way the international system in Asia works changes fundamentally because the relative power of the players is changing, obvious way, Russia, China, all that sort of stuff. And yet Australian governments of both persuasions are refusing to recognise that. When you hear Australian politicians say, as some of you may have, that Australia doesn't have to choose between its relationship with America and relationship with China, they're just pretending something isn't happening, which obviously is. I mean, they are making choices all the time. You watch Tony Abbott go to Beijing next month and watch what he says. He's making choices all the time, very difficult ones. So what's gone wrong? Well, back in 1880, Australia faced a similar fundamental change in our strategic environment as British power declined. And a whole lot of statesmen, as they then were, people like Alfred Deakin, said, oh, there's a bit of a big change. Why don't we respond to it? And they did. Federation was their response. They fundamentally changed the way Australia worked politically in response to a change in their environment before they had to. They got out there ahead of the game. Now, I just make the point, I don't think at least at the federal level, maybe you guys in the States are getting it right, at least at the federal level, I don't think we've got the quality of policy processes that we deserve. Whose fault is that? Well, there's lots of blame. The quality of our journalism contributes to that. The quality of our public service, I fear, contributes to that. But in the end, it's the quality of the politicians, and in the end, that's down to us because we vote for them. So it's a pretty deep problem.
I'm sorry, I'm very selfish taking a question for myself because I think people in the room will be interested in this. I'm very keen to hear from both you, Will, and you, Hugh, whether you made a conscious decision to enter the public debate. I have a funny feeling that maybe you just couldn't help yourselves, but whether you made a conscious decision, and if there has been any point at which you have genuinely regretted it.
No, I don't think I made a conscious decision. I think I've sort of evolved into it, primarily working overseas in Sweden, because the particular position I had put me in touch with a lot of politicians, mainly in the European Union around that space. When I came back to Australia in 2004, I was sort of drafted by the government of that day to start giving some advice on climate change issues, and one thing led to another. So it's more of an evolutionary process. It wasn't something I aspired to do, but once I got into it, I enjoyed it, developed a knack for it to some extent, and thought that it was a very useful thing for someone at my stage of the career to do. No regrets at all.
I think my story is the opposite of Will's. That is, I did start working in Canberra as a public servant, and I enjoyed doing what I was doing a great deal, but I just quickly realised that it seemed to me that being involved in the public debate was just going to be more fun, and so I looked for a way to do it, and I looked to structure my career in ways that I could get myself, first of all, closer to the top of the decision-making process, and within government and involved in the public debate. So I spent a while working as a journalist and that sort of thing, and then went back into government with that sort of behind me, always trying to stay as close to where the politics and the high policy was going on. So no, I never wanted to do anything else really. It's sort of a vocation for me. So I kicked and gouged to get into it. He had to be dragged into it, I think, is the difference. I have never regretted it for a moment. I can't imagine ever having done anything else.
We have a question in the middle.
Hello, Will and Hugh. It's fantastic to hear from you both. It sounds like you've both had a career, like a lifetime, based around this sort of influencing policy. And I just wonder what's the time frame difference between providing an opinion on policy and actually influencing policy? Because I think an opinion is something that would happen in a short term, and influence may take many years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, that's exactly right. You can throw out opinions every day, but the challenge is to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. And so the challenge is to build a body of ideas which need to be more than just an opinion on what's happening in the Ukraine today or whatever, but actually fits together into a cohesive policy logic that helps to define the big questions in your field. In my case, the big questions are, for example, what kind of armed forces does Australia need? And, well, let me confess, just amongst us girls, I'll have an opinion on anything to do with armed forces, Australia's armed forces, but do they all add up to something? So the challenge is to build, as I say, a sort of a construct. And the extent to which you can actually influence outcomes depends on the extent to which you can build a cohesive argument in the space, which really helps to shape or drive the policy logic. These are the objectives. This is how we should achieve them. This is how much we should spend. This is why spending that much is justified in order to achieve those objectives. And that really is, at the risk of sounding a bit melodramatic, that is a life's work, if you know what I mean. These are huge issues. They have huge time frames. And I think if, for example, you talk to people from Treasury, they'd have the same response. The Treasury has to respond to all sorts of individual things that happen day by day. But in order to really help shape outcomes, you need to have a view of where Australia's economy is going and a view of the measures that we have to undertake. And, the good news is, notwithstanding the deficiencies in the policy process I mentioned a second ago, the good news is you can do it. it's not that hard as an individual to have a perceptible influence on the way in which big decisions are made. And that's why I say I would never have wanted to do anything else. You know, how could you resist that?
Yeah, just one very quick comment along the lines that Hugh said. To have influence takes time. You cannot go in just a couple of meetings or even a year or two and expect to have much influence. The important thing there is, from my perspective, you need to build a relationship where the politicians trust the information you're going to give them. And that takes time, it takes a lot of care on the part of the scientist or the other expert to do that. But there is no shortcut, in my view, to having influence. You got to do the hard yards, and you got to develop trust, that you're a trusted person in terms of the veracity of the advice you're giving.
We have a question down the front. If you say it, I can relay. Oh, here it comes.
Okay, this is more of a philosophical question for you both. Looking back into sort of human history, some of the greatest leaps forward were achieved when societies faced problems where in their present form, in their present socio-political constructs, were insoluble. So new forms of government, new forms of social constructions had to emerge in the process of trying to solve that problem. Yeah. Do you think climate change might be one of them, where we can once and for all get rid of tribalism in many of the forms that it presents itself?
Look, I think the jury's still out on that. But along the lines of what you're suggesting about new ways of doing things, I think the potential of social media to change how societies deal with this issue is actually quite large. I'm sort of an old fogey on that. I don't know much about it, but working with a climate council that has a lot of younger people who know how to use social media, it's pretty impressive how information flows around there. In fact, there's probably more people getting their information from those sort of sources than they do from the traditional media. On the other hand, the few people that do get it, like the politicians from the traditional media, are very important. So we're in a dynamic situation in terms of how information gets shared, how it gets generated, how knowledge gets generated and moved around. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying there's some interesting tools, these sort of prosumers, people that are consuming and producing. Not just electricity with solar PV, but people are producing as well as consuming news and knowledge through social media. And I think that's a different dynamic in the sort of democracy like we have in Australia. It offers a lot of opportunities, I think, to deal with complex problems like climate change.
Yeah, I can easily buy the argument. My instinct is, knowing much less about it than he does, my instinct is that climate change is a problem of a scale that could easily drive fundamental changes in what you might call the social system. The challenge is to see whether we can in fact make it work. And our own experience, and I don't just mean our experience, but the experience that we have from recent generations, and you know, we're all victims of the extrapolation fallacy. We pay much more attention to the recent data. And for a couple of 100 years, societies like ours have adapted very well to a couple of big things, like the Industrial Revolution. You know, phenomenal adaptation produced the kind of societies we're all used to. So we tend to have a kind of an embedded faith in the idea that these adaptations are easy, that they'll happen. Now, and you know, so people like Tony Abbott somehow think this will all work itself out, because things have worked out pretty well mostly for the last couple of 100 years for societies like ours. Now, you know, one of the reasons it seems to me that a country like China, which you'd think would have a lot to gain from pushing climate change to one side, actually has been relatively active, is that they had completely revolutionised their society 2 or 3 times in the last century because they had forgive the French, a really shit-house time. Things went very, very badly for them repeatedly. So they're used to, shall I use the word, revolutions, and the revolution that finished in 49 wasn't the last of them by any means. And so they're actually more acclimatised to the idea that every so often you take society and just say, let's change the whole way this works. We have come from extremely successful, radically successful, but very stable societies. And so we've got out of the habit of running revolutions like that. And it's tempting to think we don't need to. Well, you know, if we don't adapt, then, you know, we will fail. There's no law that says that every story has to have a happy ending. This one could easily have quite an unhappy ending. So I'm a bit gloomy on that one.
Are there any final questions? Oh, well, on that light note, we do have one. One in the middle. Okay, we'll take this as our final question.
Yeah, my question, Neville Exton from ANU, my question is whether we should be focusing more on amelioration at this stage while the politics is bad as far as climate change is concerned. Should we be doing all sorts of little steps that at least help us face the future within Australia?
Look, I think there's a limit to how much you can ameliorate, and by ameliorate I think you mean adapt to the way the system's changing. I referred to the fact that we're dealing with an extremely complex system, the Earth system itself, and one of the features of a complex system is a lot of its dynamics are not linear. So as you put pressure on the system, it reacts a little bit, temperature goes up a little bit, but you start to see canaries in the coal mine in terms of what's happening at the poles, what's happening to atmospheric circulation, what's happening in the ocean in many different ways, whereas that's where most of the heat's going. So to complex system scientists, this is quite worrying, and so by just ameliorating or adapting, we could be in fact laying ourselves the ultimate trap, thinking that gradual change is what this is all about, when in fact it almost surely isn't. So I would, and that's a very, very difficult message to get across, because one of the ways that science has been really effective in the past is cause-effect logic, but that doesn't work so well in a complex system. So trying to persuade policy people, hey, wait a minute, this stuff that we've taught you in science, that if you change a part of the system, it's going to respond in a certain way, well, that's probably not the way the climate's going to behave. That's tricky stuff to try to get across.
Okay, so we have dealt with some rather heavy issues. I'm sure everyone's feeling like a bit of light relief. I have learnt a lot from listening to both Professor Hugh White and Professor Will Steffen, some great pearls of wisdom. It seems like in their understanding, it's not that difficult to have a substantial influence on policy and the policy debate. However, it takes a great deal of time, planning and strategic approach. So there's something for all of us to take away. I would like you to join me in thanking not only the two professors on the stage, but all of the speakers today. Thank you.